was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And they'd say, oh, but aren't you so glad that you're in America? I said, well, I know a lot of Russian filmmakers. They have a lot more freedom than I have. All they have to do is be careful about criticizing the government.
Sorry, I was playing a little air guitar with myself. Greetings, I'm your host, Jason Miles, and welcome to another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. A little pop life-ish, as we are digressing from the usual, more serious show that we do here on TIR. And we're going to talk a little bit about movies, horror movies, sci-fi and horror movies. So glad to have you guys here with us. Live, and of course happy to have the people that will be listening on the audio only and definitely watching on the rewatch. Before we start, if you're new to the channel, please hit like and subscribe. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you're alerted whenever we go live and do crazy stuff like this. As always, thank you to all the subscribers on YouTube and Twitch and all the audio only podcast formats you find us on. Also, of course, thank you to patrons. Collectively, you are the fuel and the engine that keeps this TIR machine moving along. Tomorrow night, we will be doing movie night. It is Friday the 13th. I don't really have a spooky sound effect. And it looks like Nightmare on Elm Street 3 is winning. I am sad by that, and I'm wearing, a Freddy Krueger t-shirt. But I really was hoping we could watch Friday the 13th, Part 4 is one of my favorites. It's like kind of fun, popcorny horror movies. Then I was like, oh man, you know what I should have said? We should have watched Halloween 3. So we have to find a way to shoehorn Halloween 3 into this month because I rewatched it recently and it's so good. If you'd like to join us for movie night tomorrow night, if you'd like to have access to champagne rooms past and present, if you would like to be in the live virtual audience for the Pascal Robert hosted Mau Mau Hour, there's only one way. Become a patron for as little as $3 a month or $30 for the year. It can all be yours. Now that we got that out of the way, can't forget to tell you guys, next Monday, tickets will be on sale for the book launch event for my latest book, my new book, my first book, first thing that I got published in print. I Was a Teenage Anarchist. It'll be live in the Bay Area November 18th. Tickets are going to go on sale Monday. Some of the names are confirmed. I can say Chris Contos will be there. Chris was in Machine Head. He's actually the founding drummer of Machine Head, founding drummer of Attitude Adjustment. He's in Forbidden right now. He's been in so many bands, a good friend of mine. Also, Rick Hanault from Exodus will be there. That's right, Rick from Exodus. We're going to have some great old school metal, hardcore punk stories from the Bay scene. It's going to be in a very cool, intimate atmosphere. You can bring your kids if you really want to. If you don't want to, of course, don't. But if you are one of those people that wants to bring your youngin' along, like we had Josh the other day call in, and he's got a young teenage daughter. If you want to bring your daughter along and hear some of these great behind the velvet rope stories, as I call them, we're going to do a lot of that. A lot of mingling. Definitely take Q&A from the audience. We're only got 50 spots. That's it. I want to kind of give you guys a go fun of what it was like for me living in the studio and kind of, even putting this thing together, talking to all these guys so much. So that's a few of the names. There's more names I can't say yet because we're waiting on a few people to confirm. But again, I'm pretty stoked about how this is coming out. This is going to be a lot of fun. But tonight we're talking about horror movies. Sometimes we try to define horror as a static genre of monsters, killers, and just overall fright. It's still the black sheep of movie genre, something many people don't take too seriously. I believe that has much to do with the blow up of the genre in the 80s, the low budget direct-to-video and cable releases, films filled with bloody, gore-filled cliches. But horror doesn't have to be demon possessions and machete-wielding killers stalking teenagers. I remember being terrified watching Pee-wee's Big Adventure at the scene where he meets the undead friendly trucker, Large Marge. To gain validity to the film critics and tastemakers, the name of the genre gets changed to mystery or suspense. And now you can win an Oscar. The Shining, Silence of the Lambs come to mind for horror fans. And there's more blood and gore in Silence of the Lambs than in Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Ridley Scott's Alien and James Cameron's Terminator are two movies that are science fiction classics, but to me, these movies are and always will be horror films with kind of a science fiction veneer. Now, the sequels to these movies are more space action than horror, but the original screenplays and films are textbook horror movies. The mood, the scores, the pacing, the jump scares, they have it all. And here to discuss this with me is my good friend, TIR, sometimes Y member, the Derick Varn. What up, dude?
Nothing much. Trying to get appropriate, obnoxious lighting. There we go. So, yeah, welcome to your show.
Welcome to a fun horror talk. You and I, even when I'm on your show, even when we're having like serious discussions, we always veer off into music. We always veer off into some sort of pop culture realm. We're around the same age. We definitely like a lot of the same stuff. You're a fan of horror movies. What makes a good horror movie to you?
Oh, that's hard. My three favorite horror movies may make it a little clearer. I think I love Gothic by Ken Russell. I love The Brood by Cronenberg.
Okay.
And then I think Texas Chainsaw is probably the quintessential horror movie because it's a movie that is super suspenseful. And yet when you watch it, you realize that the first time you see it, you think it's the most gory thing you've ever seen. And you go back and watch it like, no, actually there's no gore in it. It tricked you. It was just so suspenseful that you thought there was. It was all implied. There's not that many movies that can pull that off. And that's why it's never been successfully remade. And then it leads to one of my other favorite horror movies, which is Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, which is a quintessential horror comedy where the horror and the comedy are actually about balance, which is hard to do. I mean, parts of that movie are ridiculous, but you know it's supposed to be. So
I love Texas Chainsaw 2. I actually saw 2 first. I bought 2 with Christmas money when I was a kid, the VHS. You know how you get like your little Christmas, well, maybe you.
Yeah. Yeah.
But still, you get your whatever holiday funds, and I went to Kmart back when they were still Kmart. I don't think if they've been around anymore, and it was in like a bin, and I was like, I got it. And then I ended up watching the original on cable one night, and the original scared the bejesus out of me. That John Larroquette voiceover in the beginning is terrifying.
Oh yeah.
Mark Owen says, "You ruined my Sonny Bono wig." I love Texas Chainsaw 2.
I believe that's the one I saw first too, and then was shocked to go back and watch the first one and realize they were both directed by the same person. For one thing.
Yeah,
but But and the massive tone shift between those two movies. I mean, the only other movies that I think successfully pull a tone shift that well between 1 and 2 is Alien and Aliens. And that is that's a huge tone shift
You
as
don't
well.
think Terminator does a good job?
Yeah, I guess I could say that. Do you consider Terminator a horror movie?
Yes.
Like that's a
Yes.
good question.
Terminator 1 is one of the most frightening movies I saw as a young person. My parents divorced when I was very young, and my father, he had me on the weekends. Interesting man, my father, and we would go to the video store. This is way before Blockbuster, and he would be like, "Pick whatever you want to see," and I'd pick something I wanted to see, and he's like, "No, you can't see that." And it wasn't like it was bad. It was like he didn't want to watch it. So he was like, "We're gonna watch Terminator." I was like 6 or 7, maybe 8. And
Yeah.
I just remember watching that movie, and Arnold Schwarzenegger was a monster to me. He was a villain to me until I went to the theater to see 2, I think. Then he stopped being a villain in my eyes.
I saw 2 first. I think the interesting thing about every movie that we mentioned, uh, because of my age, which is just like 2 years younger than you, but it would have hit me just slightly different because those 2 years would have been important in the 80s. I saw the second one of every one of those movies. Saw Aliens before I saw Alien. I saw Terminator 2 before I saw Terminator, and I saw Texas Chainsaw way after I saw Texas Chainsaw 2. And yeah, maybe an 80s thing. People are throwing out other movies, Gremlins and Gremlins 2. Although the thing is with Gremlins and Gremlins 2 is Gremlins is a horror comedy. Gremlins 2 is like a farce. So it's I mean, that's kind of scary, not really. Like
Yeah. Both
but yeah,
of those movies I think are like these fun films. There's a weird point though in the early 80s with all the Star Wars knockoffs and Alien knockoffs, because you have these 2 movies that really hit big. Star Wars is a maybe not Oscar-winning phenomenon, but it's a huge blockbuster phenomenon. Science fiction films aren't supposed to make money like this, and everybody tries to cash in, and everybody's cash in doesn't work. I mean, Disney of all people has an extremely failed cash in. For those that remember movie The Black Hole,
oh god, I do
I
remember
mean,
that
I
movie.
watched The Black Hole if I saw it on TV. I tried to watch it with my young son, the little guy, and he just wasn't digging it. It's a slow-paced movie that was a little all over the place.
I think I saw it at a friend's house on the Disney Channel in the early 90s.
And you were like, "What the hell is this?"
Yeah, it's like this is weird Disney space horror.
Yeah,
Like
it's
for
almost
kids.
it's almost like a they were all over the place. And Alien was what, 79, so before Empire, but it's definitely during the bonanza of Star Wars and all the kind of wannabe Star Wars knockoffs. And it's written as a space horror movie. It's not supposed to be a science fiction film. And it actually wins awards. It won an Oscar for something, I'm not sure, maybe special effects. But that movie, I watched it actually before we went on, and it's a horror movie. It's just a horror movie in outer space.
I mean, it's no Event Horizon or Pandemonium, but yeah, I mean, and it is from a time. I think we do have to remind ourselves that like there were children's horror or young adult
Mhm.
horror movies in the 80s. That's like I mean, they've tried to bring them back in the last decade or so, but like Poltergeist, if we remember, even though as a child in the 80s, I found the first 2 of those movies terrifying.
Terrifying.
Uh, those were made for kids,
Yeah.
effectively.
Amblin. Those
Like,
are I don't know if they're I think they're Amblin movies. I think
yeah,
that, Spielberg creates the PG-13 rating. And we kind of have to remember PG movies before the PG-13. You can have curse words, nudity, PG-13 movies. Go back and watch a PG-13 movie or a PG movie pre 1984.
Yeah, I can tell you a story about that. That's pretty hilarious. When I I teach in Utah and I taught in a school. And in this school there was a hard rule, like you could show any movie that's PG without getting a signature, and it was a film class. And so I showed Reds and Cabaret because they're both PG.
Mm-hmm. Were there some letters to the principal after that?
No, I got away with it, which is amazing. But yeah, there should have been letters to the principal, but Gremlins is one of the first movies that got the PG-13. I don't think it's the one that initiated it.
No, Indiana
it was
Jones and the Temple of Doom.
Indiana Jones, yeah, and the Temple of Doom did. Another movie that messed around with tone and tried to be a horror movie, kind of.
Golema. Yeah.
So yeah, the 80s isn't like, I'm a movie snob, and you know, I am in my head. There are two wolves, one of which is a Criterion Collection, and the other which is like whatever on Shudder.
Yeah.
And it just tells you a lot about me. But I grew up watching, like, thinking about like this big shift, because 70s movies are my Criterion brain, but 80s movies is Shudder brain. Like, and I don't want to say that they're actually not good films, because they, particularly in the early 80s, once they got out of 70s mode, and I think how they got out of 70s mode is the movies that you're talking about, like what brings the blockbusters, Jaws, but what brings like 80s movies as we think about them as Star Wars and Alien.
Yep.
And there's this period of like really well made schlock, like people have really who cut their teeth on B movies for reels and drive-throughs in the 70s, who are cut their teeth watching them, but take that aesthetic and then make amazing movies out of it. I mean, you know, the
Cameron.
most Cameron, Carpenter
comes out of that, yeah.
Carpenter comes out of that.
Craven, all these guys come out of that.
Yeah, Craven comes out of that and porn, but
yeah.
But you know, you get this kind of this mixture, and specifically with someone like Craven, like Craven's referencing art house movies. But yeah, those are also two fair. You asked me in the beginning what defines a horror movie. I should have actually mentioned Possession and Suspiria as also both being on my top. Like, I could just go.
We could go on forever. Look, the top three is extremely interchangeable, and I think it's foolish for us to think that we can simply have an easy top three. I don't have an easy top three. I have movies that I'm into at the moment, which you can throw on. I wouldn't say for example, I wouldn't say Poltergeist. And if you were over here and you're like, dude, let's watch Poltergeist, I'm like, oh, this is like my favorite movie. You know what I mean? It's one of those things for me.
Last time that we hung out together, we watched Ken Russell's Lair of the White Worm.
So. That's right. We were at Dubin's.
Yeah.
And I was following us. First of all, anyone watching the show right now, I don't know if you guys, I'm sure there's a lot of people watching this, especially this episode, that fall asleep to movies. Don't try to fall asleep to Ken Russell.
No.
Don't do it.
I woke up in a weird snake orgy. Like,
I would just kind of randomly doze off and wake up like, oh, that snake lady bite that guy's dick off.
Is it like, did I wake up and there was a Roman orgy going on and someone got eaten by a snake? Like,
Ken Russell movies, just don't do it. Do not do it. So I think you're getting into something I did want to ask you. Do you think the oversaturation of popcorn, low budget horror taint the genre, or has it always been a second tier genre from the Universal monster days and the Hammer House of Horror eras?
I don't know that it was all. I mean, it's hard to say if for example, I mean, Universal Monsters wasn't second tier until the Hays Code, and they had to make them funny. Hammer House of Horror, I mean, it's just high gothic. I don't consider them second tier either. Some of them are bad. I don't know how many versions of Carmilla you can actually make, but I would say they go in and out. I mean, one of the things about a horror movie is unlike sci-fi, they're remarkably cheap to make. They're great first films, you know, and I think what part of what tastes the genre is the end of the Universal horror era, and then like that middle period of Hammer, up into the 60s before Hammer gets interesting again, where it's like, we are as salacious as we can be, but we're not that salacious, you know, lots of heaving bosoms, but we're obviously shooting night and the day. And I think it was a genre that lended itself to being a second stream on a drive-through. Because to make a high-end sci-fi movie just costs a lot of money. I mean, like, you know, even back then, and when you watch cheap horror movies now, from like the 70s, some of them don't stand out for how cheap they were made. Like, they really, you know, they don't. I watched a lot of the Romero movies that everyone forgets, Marty and what is it, Season of the Witch. And I watched those recently, and you know, they weren't made with any money at all. But you really kind of can't tell compared to everything else. I mean, they're not like Rosemary's Baby or anything, but you really can't tell. Whereas like old Castle movies, if you like, those are fun. But they look cheap now. But go watch a Leslie Nielsen, and people think I'm referring to him as a comedian, but actually in the 60s and 70s, he was mostly in like sci-fi movies.
A very serious actor.
Yeah, and he was a very serious actor. Those Leslie Nielsen cheap sci-fi movies from the late 60s, early 70s look so much older than the horror movies from the same time period. Like, just day and night difference. You think about something that's fairly high budget for the time period, like Forbidden Planet, and watch it by a movie just a few years older. Night of the Dead, Night of Living Dead. And tell me which one looks better now. You know, it's I think that has an attraction to it because you can put them together pretty cheaply. Also, once the Hays Code was away, you could be sleazy about it, and you didn't have to be all as good as Hitchcock and just imply sleazy. You could just do it.
Is Hitchcock the master of horror or suspense? Right?
You're going to get into like how to divide the suspense horror line. In some ways, I think obviously he's a master of suspense, but in some ways, if you watch some of his late movies, you definitely get the feeling that he's almost just out and out in pure horror. To me, the master of horror of that time period is actually someone we can't mention anymore because he's a very, very bad person. But
Roman
Polanski.
Rosemary's Baby it's good.
Yeah.
You can't front on Rosemary's Baby. Like,
yeah.
Also, that takes place before the incidents happened with him.
Yeah, you can watch that with a fairly clean conscience, but
maybe not the Ninth Gate. You know, that's a difference.
Yeah, I mean, I have seen that movie, but I didn't know because I think I saw that in high school, and I didn't know
that was Polanski either.
Yeah. It's unfortunate. A lot of my favorite movies are Polanski movies, but nonetheless, I would still have him in prison. all that said, I think horror movies also the gamut of what counts. As we get into like suspense or thrillers, I am still yet to figure out the exact line between a realistic slasher movie, a suspense thriller, a suspense movie with a murderer like Psycho, and a thriller. Like, even if you write down the the various film elements, and I've taught film before, there's not really the elements are the same in all those three cases in almost all aspects, and yet there's a vibe difference between them, and that's pretty much the only thing I can say is the difference. Like, it's down to like little choices in like filmography or acting choices are, but on paper they're almost identical, and yet Psycho versus Single White Female versus I don't know, Rope by Hitchcock. And so Psycho's the excellent one. Is it a suspense movie or is it a horror movie?
It starts off with a very horrific intro, right? You kill off the star, which we don't really see again till Scream.
Yeah.
And I think Psycho 1 is more of a horror movie than the sequel.
Yeah.
The sequel, which I really enjoyed, Psycho 2, I thought was really, really good. That's a little different. There's not a lot of violence in it. It takes so long for a kill to even happen because you have to get the whole gaslighting thing really set in, and they set it in so good that you're just kind of following this continuing story of Norman Bates. I don't know. I've always felt like horror for me isn't necessarily just a genre, because a lot of the horror movies that I watch, horror movies, quotations, I laugh at. And a lot of people that go watch like over the top slashers, especially by the time you get to stuff like Freddy vs. Jason. Me and Ben sat here and watched Freddy vs. Jason, and I had saw it when it came out and I didn't remember it. And I watched it just sitting down, no devices, nothing stopping me from enjoying the film. And I just kept going, this is what it is. And it's really good at being what it is. It's not trying to be smart. It's not trying to, terrify me with mood. It is what I want as a fan of these, characters. And I think there's genres of movies now like that. Like, you like these kind of schlocky slasher blood fest movies with interesting kills, we'll make them for you. And that's what you got in the 80s, but we call it horror. And I think because it's called horror, when people weren't scared because it was, what's coming.
Yeah.
Then people, I don't like horror. It doesn't scare me. Like, how many times have you heard someone say that?
Yeah, I think there's two periods of horror that do that, frankly. The mid to late 80s, when you get the the three slasher trilogies that have up to like 10 sequels, and like 9 of them come out in 3 years.
Yeah.
Like
the cash-ins.
Yeah, I mean, like Friday the 13th is an example. Like I think the first 3 of those movies are pretty brilliant, and then they get good again like around Freddy versus Jason. It was a lot of years later, but like by the time you're going to Manhattan in space, you got a problem. It's they get so far removed. We talk about watching stuff out of order. Like, I didn't see the first Friday the 13th movie until I was an adult, and realized how different of a movie it is. It feels a lot more like a 70s movie. I mean, which I guess it kind of makes sense.
And again, no one knows. Let's remember when I can't remember the guy's name that makes Friday the 13th. Oh, his name is slipping me. Anyway, when he makes that movie, he's like, hey, this Halloween thing is taking off, and he sends his buddy to go watch Friday the 13th or to go watch Halloween. And it's like, tell me what's it about, and then we're going to make our own little version of Halloween. And they make Friday the 13th, and that goes off. Halloween, the sequel to Halloween, I think it's horrible.
Which one?
The first Halloween 2, Carpenter doesn't want to make because Carpenter's like, I ended the movie, it's over.
Right.
And they're like, nope, you made, what is it, $300,000 budget, you made $30 million. You're an earner. The movie industry's like the mob. You're an earner now. We got to get another one of these.
Like the mob. Anyway, go ahead.
I was trying to be subtle. And then Friday the 13th, for whatever reason, there is a lot of other of these, the original name of Halloween is the babysitter murders.
Yeah.
Right. So there's a lot more of these kind of slasher films that are coming out, to the point where I think Friday the 14th or Saturday the 14th, I think it's called, the parody comes out in like 84.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing how, like, you go watch Black Christmas and Sleepaway Camp, and I mean, there's tons of these coming out in the late 70s, early 80s. Some of them predate Halloween, but Halloween really gets the formula down. And it actually, unfortunately for me, I saw Halloween after I'd seen all these other slashers, so it was not the revelation that it is if you watch it clean. What is it? Prom Night's another one. There's just so many.
And these movies don't have the thing that is going to be the character that's going to come back for whatever reason, and I don't know what that thing is. None of us really know what that thing is, because Michael Myers, and then you have Jason Voorhees, and you don't even get Jason Voorhees until the second film.
Yeah, I mean, he's not in the first. I mean, his hand is in the first film.
It's Pamela Voorhees, right?
Yeah.
It's his mom. His mom is the killer in the first movie. And again, that movie was made like the other movies from Alien and Terminator. Those movies weren't made to be franchises.
No, they were not.
That was the last thing those people thought when they made them. That's why the sequels are always so kind of, especially when you get into the Terminator like 15 or whatever the hell they're on. You're like, what the hell's going on here?
Well, Terminator, like after 2, we just don't mention them.
I tried to watch Salvation. I was like, I'm good.
I've seen all of them, unfortunately, but yeah. So, it's interesting that when I think about this whole problem of sequels, because I think that's part of why we associate it as cheap. But I'm going to finish the other time period that I think makes people hate horror. And before I get on to that, and that's the aughts torture porn period.
Ooh, yeah.
Because that's just I mean, like, I like extreme cinema. See Criterion Brain and Shutter Brain meet in New French Extremity, but during whatever it is about the American version of that, the Eli Roth version of that just felt cheap and like gross, like, and not fun at all. Just and so a lot of people who I meet who are like in their early 30s, late 20s, who grew up during that, or during the late 90s, during the crystal clean daytime soap horrors that are all like ripoffs of Scream 1. That's okay. So there's lots of periods. So basically most of the aughts, the late 90s and the late 80s are not good for horror at all. The mid 90s, you get this explosion of like stuff that's aware of the limitations of the 80s genre pieces and calling attention to it by the same people who made the 80s genre pieces too. I mean, Screen is Wes Craven, and Craven's an interesting character and all this stuff because he kind of in each decade up into the aughts, he actually makes a horror movie that calls attention to and redefines the genre. So like Last House on the Left in the 70s, get your both kind of culminates your exploitation and changes your exploitation horror. Friday the 13th kind of shifts for good and ill.
You mean
Nightmare
on Elm Street? Yeah,
Nightmare on Elm Street shifts for good and ill. What's going on in slashers? I mean, because it adds a supernatural element, it adds social critique, although it doesn't maintain the social critique very long at all. But and then you get Scream, which is the 90s meta commentary on the slasher horror genre as established by Carpenter and Craven himself. So you get, he kind of defines all the errors. And one of the things about him is that he never has a budget. It's actually kind of amazing that he never is given like a huge budget. Like,
but he learned, right? He learned doing all those crappy made for TV movies. Like, you can get a lot of that stuff on DVD. I mean, I don't know how many people watching the show actually try to own media. I'm sure you could find a lot of his non-cinema release stuff on like an Amazon or Shudder or something like that. But he made a lot of made for TV stuff. Even Deadly Friend kind of looks like a made for TV movie.
And until the 90s, I would actually say one of the things about his movies is Craven's an interesting director, but no one's going to accuse him of being like an amazing cinematographer.
No.
Like, or having a good eye for that. But which is not true for someone like Carpenter. Carpenter has shot composition even in his like shitty college movies. But I think it's very interesting to think about what the 80s did for horror, and then people coming in and they come in and these time periods, because horror movies, like I said way back in the beginning, you can make a fairly good horror movie with a twist for not that much money.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're a popular genre forever as far as the mob-like organization that we call what's left of the studio system is concerned, because you don't, when you hear about movies making crazy money to cost ratio, it's like a first time comedy, but it's got to be a first time comedy because the actors are well known, you're going to pay for them.
Mm-hmm.
Or it's a horror movie. That's where you can really make where the difference between the budget and the return without it being a super blockbuster really is key. And I think that's why it's also a genre that stuck around in the era of super blockbusters, because you can still make them for nothing. So
I mean, horror and blaxploitation in the 70s, those are two things that are still, kind of getting cranked out.
Yeah, and now that porn has killed the erotic thriller, that's that you lose one cheap genre. But
that's a damn shame too, because is it Body Double? What is the movie with oh god, not Donald Sutherland, it's Michael Caine. Isn't it Michael Caine?
I think it's Body Double.
Is it I get those two white guys confused. Angie Dickinson's in it. I know it's Angie Dickinson and the woman from RoboCop. I can't think of her name for the life of me. Is it Body Double or Body Heat? I get those two confused all the time. I think De Palma directed it, right?
I think it's Body Heat.
Dress to Kill.
Dress to Kill. Okay, that's completely different.
Thank you. I know it's something where.
Oh yeah, that's Angie Dickinson and Michael Caine and Keith Gordon, and
yeah, that's the movie that I'm thinking of, where that's the perfect erotic thriller. It comes on too late for us to watch as little people when it comes on cable.
Yeah,
it's never going to come on in the day.
You might watch Scrambled Cinemax for it before the weird French
Yeah.
stuff comes on. For those of you who are old enough to know what we're talking about.
Someone said very giallo. It is a very giallo film with the star filter on it, the colors, the killer first person view that you get. Like that's really a lot of the giallo movies, not a lot, but some of those giallo movies are kind of erotic thriller type.
I would say, yeah, most of them. I mean, the thing is, giallos were like every 35 seconds, like for a while. The people have. It's interesting because giallo is a genre that I think is really like nerds have brought back. Like we all talk about it now, but like in the 80s, we didn't talk about it. But I think it's because we were watching giallo knockoffs.
Oh yeah.
You know, everything from like Dress to Kill, which is kind of one of the primo examples. But by the time you get to the late 80s, early 90s, and you get to like the 85 Michael Douglas films,
Where you can't tell the difference between, you're like, which one is this?
Yes,
is
this
this one
Fatal Attraction, or is it
is this the other one that he did where it was like Fatal Attraction?
Or the other one are what was with Michael Douglas playing like sleazeballs in
Because he was getting pussy.
Obviously.
I mean,
but
you
yeah,
would too. You'd look at the script. Am I fucking? I'm in.
But to bring it to the topic of the show, which we have yet to really get to, I mean, we got to half of it. Horror is also something that you compare with any other genre.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you want to make like a romantic comedy horror, you can. If you want to make a weird exploitation, gross out movie, you can. If you want to do an art house movie that can actually get played somewhere other than your local independent cinema thing at midnight, you can. That's not true for a lot of other genres. Like you would think, you would think it might be, but it just doesn't end up that way. Like, you know, there's not too many, for example, like Western comedy horrors. Like, you know, there's like Westerns and space Westerns, and that's about it. Like, whereas horrors, you can just slap it on any genre. Like, and then it has, as we were talking about in the beginning, infinite subgenres. Nearly infinite subgenres. And the thing about the 80s that I think people, because it wasn't just film, like the 70s and 80s is also like the high point of horror pulp paperbacks. Like there's like hundreds. It's hard to find all of them now. Like I've been trying to, there was recently, I think about 6 years ago, a book called Paperback from Hell, which actually cataloged all the 70s, 80s pulp horrors. So it was ubiquitous in culture, period. Like, because I was also reading this shit, like Dean Koontz and
Anne Rice.
Yeah.
King
can't remember.
Pumping
yeah,
around.
King was top. King was king of the world in this time period. Like, car wreck and cocaine couldn't slow him down.
It tried.
Like, yeah, it really did.
Please, no one watch Maximum Overdrive.
Which I guess is a good transition to some movies that are questionable. Like are they horror or not? Since we're doing this.
All right, here, look, question 3 on this list of talking points, because I wanted to get into the whole science fiction thing, because I think there's some movies that we look at as science fiction that are frightening to me. Would you call The Running Man a horror film? To me, there's nothing more frightening than the future that movie predicts. I feel like we're almost there. 5 more years and we'll see people cheering on the death of convicted criminals for sport.
Oh man. Yeah,
it's fun. It's kind of a fun movie, right? When you watch it, and that's kind of weird to say about this dystopian nightmare of a movie that is The Running Man, but the kills in it to me are very similar to the kills that we're enjoying in the Nightmare on Elm Streets and the Friday the 13th and the Halloweens and whatever, the Sleepaway Camp 15s. All these movies are coming out with all these kind of super violent kills, and there's some pretty, not over the top gnarly, but gnarly enough kind of brutality in
There's a chainsaw fight in it. There's a chainsaw fight.
But you know what I mean? It's that movie sets the. I think if you make it today, it's probably going to be a little darker in actual in presentation, because a lot of it happens in the day, a lot of the running around. And
yeah, it doesn't. It's not framed like a horror movie, but man, one, you talk about dark political satire. It's not just that we're watching people like fight for sport to get rid of criminals. It's also like people are framed for war crime atrocities on civilians doing protest.
Yeah,
like that's like the amount, the number of layered satirical pieces in that movie is kind of absurd. You could tell that when Stephen King was night lighting as Richard Bachman, he was doing a fuck lot of coke. But but you're right in that the it is framed a lot like an action movie. Also, it's framed like a satire.
Mm-hmm.
Also, it's the kills are the kind of ridiculous kills that you'll see in like a Nightmare on Elm Street 4. Like it, definitely by the time you get to like Freddy's Dead, it's actually similarly grotesque and ridiculous.
Ben says Freddy's Dead is when Freddy starts acting like Bugs Bunny.
He kind of does, actually. But nonetheless, it's a crazy movie. Is it a horror movie? And I would say it's not, but it's not because vibes. It's actually like it's one of those movies that's terrifying to think about once you finish it. Mm-hmm. It's just like, what did I see in this movie? And I saw that movie at a hotel in 1988, and I know it was 1988 because it was I'm not gonna get in a long story. My parents one time tried to improve their class station by doing Amway. And so I got dragged for like a year to these stupid Amway conferences that my parents couldn't afford. And at one of these stupid conferences, I was in a lobby watching The Running Man. I know it was 1988 because I can smell the gross cigarette 80s gold everything, neon everything, like of this fucking cheap hotel, and I believe it was in like New Orleans. So I very much remember when I first saw that movie, and I love that movie, but it is a movie that I think if you just changed the way it was shot, it's a horror movie.
Right? Like, if you change it, make it a little bit darker, the score is very exciting because it's an action movie. If I describe this movie, there's a man that's a police officer. I think he's a SWAT team guy.
Yeah.
I think he's ex-military. And his name is the Butcher of Bakersfield because there is a food riot. Poverty has gotten so out of control that people are rioting in the streets for food. And the call is murder everybody in the street. And Schwarzenegger's character pushes back against the call and he won't do it. And he's taken out. And then through deep fake technology, they make it look like he killed all these people. And then he goes to prison, and it's a prison work camp. And he's supposed to be in there for life. And in this kind of dystopian prison world in which he lives, there's people that are trying to get out, and he's the strong guy because he's Arnold Schwarzenegger, and of course he gets out, and he gets captured, And in getting captured, if you are a felon, you get a chance to play this game called The Running Man, where you try to get out of a certain area, kind of like a maze, and you're chased by do they call them gladiators? What do they call them? I forget what they call them, but there's different stages of escape. And the way the game is sold to the viewing public is that there's several people that have made it through. And I think everyone that plays in the game has committed a capital offense, right? They've committed murder. And so the people that are chasing you will murder you. And people are cheering on the murder. And Richard Dawson, who, younger people probably don't know, he used to be the host of a show called Family Feud that maybe you guys know Steve Harvey for hosting. Now Richard Dawson was the original host. And he's in this movie kind of playing himself. And you find out that no one's won the game. Everyone that they said has won, it's all deep fake technology. They were all dead. And the whole thing is you're not supposed to win the game. They just kill the shit out of you. And that's kind of a frightening future to think about. There's a class of people that we're feeding into this entertainment machine. Black Mirror does a good job of talking about this as well, like with the 15 million credits episode, where everyone's got to ride the bike to produce energy for the world. And if you save up 15 million credits, you can apply to be on the kind of America's Got Talent show. And if you make it, then you can, change your station in life. And that movie feels more real to me, especially, with the events that are going on in different parts of the world right now, where you literally see people walling themselves off, hoarding all the resources. And it's just not in the Middle East. It's kind of all over the place. We definitely see it here in this country. I mean, what do you think gated communities are? It's scary, but it's kind of billed as a fun action movie.
Yeah, and it's shot as a fun action movie too.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that when I talk about the vibes, one of the things you have to put together is, for a lot of the difference between, say, some kinds of action and some kinds of horror, a camera angle and lighting is really the only thing separating them. And that's, not to say that it isn't important. It is extremely important, but it's something to notice, particularly in the time period we're talking about, because one of the interesting things about the 70s film is very interesting because it's the end of the first studio system, and and then you have the rise of the 70s auteurs, but by the time you get to the 80s, there's not really auteurs in the same way. There's blockbuster directors and everything else, but they're also very much throwing darts at a wall and then picking out the spaghetti from where the darts land and then throwing the spaghetti at the wall. There's when you actually break down the components of a lot of these movies from the 80s, you're just this is 4 genres at once. And sometimes they work, and not just in horror. Think of a movie what genre is Back to the Future 2?
That's a good question. What genre is, someone's talking about Predator? What genre is Predator? Seriously, that's a frightening movie. Predator's frightening.
Terrifying, actually. But is it a action horror? I mean, action sci-fi, action horror sci-fi?
Brutal. It's brutal in the day, right? The Predator is just ganking fools in the day, and you're just like, dude, this is frightening. And again, this is my whole take on horror. I don't really look at it as it's always got to be monsters and demons and jump scares, because again, one of the best jump scares in cinema history is Pee-wee's Big Adventure.
Oh yeah,
Large Marge gets me every time. Every time.
I actually still remember being terrified of that as a kid. Like just that one scene. It's the only
scary,
scene in there, but it's
right?
terrifying.
Because for the rest of the movie, you're kind of like this. I remember my mom took me. I don't know, I was 9. I think I was 8 years old. Maybe took me to the theater to see it. I begged to see it, and when that scene happens, I remember screaming. She yelled at me for screaming. And then I was like afraid for almost the rest of the movie because I'm just like, what else are you going to throw at me, Pee Wee Herman?
Not a lot. It's just gonna get weird.
This is,
But
yeah, it got weird. He gets his bike back, and I'd still have a crush on, E.G. Daily, Dottie. Uh, but like that scene is frightening. You know what's frightening to me as a child? Darth Vader.
oh yeah, the first one.
There's
Yeah.
nothing more scary than Darth Vader. Darth Vader is like your dad with magical powers, right? When you're a little kid, he's just choking people out for disagreeing with him in a meeting.
Yeah.
He was the ultimate evil for people our age until people our age dealt with our fear by making him funny.
Yeah, that makes sense, actually. It's a time period of like it's very interesting to compare Star Wars to what Star Wars is partly based off of. I mean, because Star Wars is based off two different books kind of slammed together and then read through George Lucas's rad liberal understanding of the Vietnam War. But half of Star Wars is Dune, and half of Star Wars is Flash Gordon.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Well, after Star Wars, both Dune and Flash Gordon finally get made.
Which I loved. Loved
Yeah.
Flash Gordon.
Flash Gordon was one of my favorite movies as a kid. Don't watch it as an adult. I mean, like, or do, but know that you remember it differently than it is. Still great. It's still a good movie. Actually, this is not me slagging off of it. Just when my memory of it was that it was better than Star Wars.
Ooh, you were one of those.
Yeah, my reality watching it as an adult is like, well, Star Wars is a better movie by a lot. Concurrently, also, my favorite science fiction movie of the 80s is not a good movie, and it is David Lynch's Dune.
Really?
Yeah, because and I think it's my favorite one because I could tell that there was a lot going on, but like, who knew at that point?
Dude, Dune, if they would have had Dune action figures, I was talking about Dan Larson about this a while back, and I asked him about that. He's like, no action figures. And if they would have had Dune action figures, maybe they did. I didn't know about them. I would have been all about Dune because that movie, I would try to get into it, but it's really long. It's really long. But
And the version
I'm talking about
the
the Lynch version.
Yeah, I know. But even if you watch the like Disney recut Lynch version with all the like half finished scenes back in it, so you can actually follow what's going on, then it's really, really long. Like you either get the 2.5 hour version or the 5 hour version.
I kind of want to watch I want to have time to watch the 5 hour version just because I watched it as a young person. It was a little over my head. It didn't have enough laser fighting for me. I'm not gonna lie.
Sandworm screaming fights.
I need all that, right? I need all of it at that point in my life. Now I could probably sit back and enjoy it. I was told that the remakes are really, really good.
Which remakes?
Or whatever the new Dunes that they made last year, I think were really good.
I think they're highly divisive. I think most people like them. I seen it. I thought it was. I'm holding my judgment to see if Villeneuve actually understands his text in the second movie.
Okay.
What I would say, the most faithful version of those movies, unfortunately, is a television miniseries from the late '90s, early aughts that came on Sci-Fi Channel. But
I know exactly what you're talking about.
But yeah, I think Lynch's Dune, I think, is actually quite good. But again, you want to talk about these blending of horror movies? They're I would never argue that Dune's a horror movie,
Mhm.
but there are terrifying parts of Dune. When they go to the Harkonnen planet,
Mhm.
that is terrifying. It is bizarre. It is as weird as a David Lynch movie. Um, the villain is absolutely evil. It's so bizarre, actually, that it's hard for kids to relate to make it scary the way Darth Vader is, because you're just like, I don't even have a frame of reference for what I'm watching. Like,
That's fair.
and for people who talk about it's like you're watching a David Lynch movie that's also for 15 minutes a Cronenberg movie,
Mm-hmm.
but then goes
Mhm.
back to being a weird David Lynch like space opera, which, by the way, no one should ever have let David Lynch make a space opera. So yeah, everyone who they've ever choose to make a Dune movie has always been like, okay, so Jodorowsky, oh, that's gonna go weird. Then Lynch, okay, and then Villeneuve. Villeneuve's the least weird of those directors. So, um, but that's the time period. I think when we talk about horror movies and we talk about I feel like we have to address the elephant in the room. We have two models of horror right now. One's finally kind of won out. One model is the A24 model. The other
Ooh,
model
okay.
is the Blumhouse model.
Okay, you're getting into my question 4, which is the A24 elevated horror helping the genre, or is it equally as cliche as the stuff from previous generations, just more pretentious?
I think elevated horror is a pretentious nomenclature for horror that is just doing what horror had done in other specific time periods. So if you like weird psychological fucked up horror like elevated horror, you can look into the mid to late 90s with like Jacob's Ladder. You can look to
Ooh,
like
yeah.
most of the 70s, and nobody was marketing these movies as art house movies. Early De Palma movies, very early De Palma movies.
Well, yeah, Jacob's Ladder was like a big budget Hollywood movie. I remember watching all
Yeah.
the trailers for that in the 90s. Yeah.
And then there's been other attempts at similar things. There's a brief period at the end of the aughts that we all forget about that also tried these psychological horror movies that kind of, when people were beginning to get exhausted with both torture porn and then the Platinum Dunes remakes of all the 80s movies.
Mhm.
We don't mention the Platinum Dune remake period. That's a bad remake period. Has anyone ever seen the remake of what is it, Friday the 13th Part 1 with the guy from
Bad News Bears.
yeah, it's the guy
Kelly
yes,
Leak for Bad News Bears.
it's got Bad News Bears guy and Supernatural guy. Like
I didn't like it.
it's bad.
When me and Ben did our whole Friday the 13th watch it, we started, I think I told you this. We couldn't remember which one had the pizza, where the faces were the pepperoni or the sausage. So we watched 4 because we thought that was the one. And then we watched it. We're like, I guess we got to watch 5. And then we watched 5 and we're like, why don't we just watch this back to 1, but in this crazy order? And then we looked up what the order was, and we had to include the remake, Freddy vs. Jason, and we were gonna watch the series Freddy's Nightmares, but that was too much to throw that in there to make it like, if you're gonna do it all.
Just do there's a lot of watching if you got to watch
We were
all of
watching them.
the
We would get done with
nightmare.
this. We would get done with our shows, and he would come over, and sometimes one of us would cook dinner, and we usually fall asleep on the couch. But more often than not, we were like, that's way better than I thought it was. Most of these movies for me, I'm like, oh, that's better than I thought it was. But yeah, the remakes.
The Platinum Doom remakes are bad. Like they're way worse than even like the Rob Zombie remakes of Halloween, those are at least kind of interesting.
Didn't need a backstory.
No, that's why did they do that? Actually, anyway,
You know why?
the character that Rob Zombie wants us to fill out is Michael Myers, a character whose very existence should be one of blank evil.
That's enough. It's a movie, dude.
It's interesting though when we think about elevated horror, because there's an interesting transition, and since we've been kind of focusing on the 80s because that's when we came up. The 70s, that's the first period of elevated horror too. Like if The Exorcist just got remade, don't watch that. Jason Gordon Green has a lot, whatever his name is, has a lot to answer for. But
I'm good. For it.
But are the Rennie Harlan prequel / Paul Schrader prequel of The Exorcist? Don't watch those either. But the original Exorcist would have been marketed today as an elevated horror movie.
I can see that.
But it's interesting to look at these cycles of reaction in horror because people are talking about the end of the aughts and we get the Purge movies, and that's when you start seeing this exhaustion with torture porn. And with home invasion movies, I think The Strangers, which is a decent movie. They're basically a remake of Elle, but whatever, they put them in masks. For those of you who don't know, Elle is a French home invasion movie that is very similar. But you start moving into what would become the Blumhouse model at the end of the aughts. Because you have the Platinum Dunes remakes, they're all bad. But then you start getting stuff like The Strangers and The Purge, and these kind of social commentary movies are a little bit more substantive, and a little bit less extreme and bleak. I mean, because even the good horror movies from the aughts are bleak.
Well, let me ask you this. What is going on financially at this moment that would make, because I don't think these movies come out of thin air.
No,
everything is a reaction off of a current moment.
I think you have to. I mean, like I'm not going to be so vulgar as to say you can trace it to business cycles, but I do, because I don't think that. But I do think if you look at like these upswing economic periods, arguably the beginning of the aughts and the 90s, those are not great for horror movies. They're just not. Late 80s also not. I mean, but in the beginning of the upswing, you will get some good ones because there's money to be invested in stuff like this, right? Whereas I think there's something about horror movies when you actually can't budget your way through it, that you have to make a more interesting movie.
Like, for example, you mentioned the Purge films. Are the Purge films a reaction to kind of that loosening of credit, that ability everybody had to kind of feel like a baller for about 10 years?
It is very much, it is very much a response to the beginning of the economic cycle, and it starts this wave of Eat the Rich movies that we're still in, kind of. I mean, The Menu is in some ways like can be traced back to the Purge, and I find that interesting. I think a lot of these movies, whereas the torture porn movies very much come out of a response, I mean, kind of explicitly, to two things. Genre wise, they're coming out of response to New French Extremity. And New French Extremity is coming out of response to Asian horror movies, which were taking over the market in the late 90s.
Dominating the market.
Yeah. And
they gave us a fresh take, though. Can we, I hate to cut you off, but can we admit that Asian movies, The Ring, we weren't seeing battle royale. There was nothing like that being made in the States. As you said, we're getting the Thing remake is horrible. Or prequel, whatever the F you want to call it. It's not very good. And the Asian were like watching The Ring the first time. That movie scared the bejesus out of me.
Right. And so it really I think it reinvigorated horror because it was dying on the like 50,000 Scream knockoffs from like, what is it? Paranoid Behavior, and I Know What You Did Last Summer, and
the urban legend of what you
Yeah.
did in the summer of your screaming.
and then you had the what is the Butterfly Effect / a Final Destination movies, which are just stupid, ridiculous kills. So in response to that, there's this, Asian horror is basically going to be your background for smart horror. New Fixed Extremity actually in some ways is a response to that. And the other thing, and just to put it into sociological context, the Iraq War had an uncensored internet.
Ooh.
So, yes, today, if you want to see horrible stuff, you can find it on Telegram. But you could accidentally just stumble on a beheading video in 2005. Like, so those two things together are a lot of where your torture porn seems to come from. And there's these anxieties about everything going on in the war on terror that seems to be in these torture porn movies, but they're not that self-conscious about it. In a lot of ways. I mean, Eli Roth will Eli Roth will talk about, his movies as critiques of the violence in American society at that time, but they're the most stupid critiques if they are, and they're very xenophobic critiques.
Agreed.
Whereas these Purge movies, I think the Purge movies are so in on this general shift of feeling after we've had loose credit for so long and people have been surviving off of it. And you have this, you do have neoliberalism, which is a term we're overused, but it's technically correct here. Really separating the not just the top 1%, but the top 20% from everybody else in a way that is reflected in the Purge. Because basically you have the top 20% versus the horde, but then at the end of the Purge, spoiler for those of you who haven't seen over a 10-year-old movie, you have the even more rich preying on the top 20% at the end. And so there's a kind of social commentary that comes out of those movies. One of the things I think is very interesting to think about why elevated horror is a problem while we're talking about this, since we're all over the map tonight. But the reason why we think of elevated horror is like horror that has to say something about society, right? And is also has good cinematography. Basically, that's what it is. But horror and sci-fi both have been genres where you can get away with that. I mean, a lot of people read horror because their basis for horror is the slasher as a very reactionary genre. But if you actually go through and look at horror movies, there is a ton of playing out of social anxiety, particularly around war and violent events. Sometimes it works out to great movies. Post-Vietnam War gives us some of the best round of the first round of 70s horror movies. Sometimes it plays out in terrible movies. Eli Roth movies, for example. Sorry, Eli Roth movies. But and we've kind of gone through, I said the A24 model. I'm aware that A24 is basically Miramax. And I could actually refer to a genre of Miramax horror movies. That was a thing in the 90s. That was all psychological horror, but it didn't have the same effect and cultural push. And the distinction between, say, the Blumhouse movies and the A24 movies have essentially collapsed. They kind of become the same thing.
Agreed.
And what we're seeing now we began the aught 20s or whatever the hell we're calling this decade, the new 20s, the end of time. I don't know. I think one of the things about these current batches of contemporary horror movies, I for me the best year in horror in a long time was 2021. Actually, it was a very good year in horror. The last 2 years not so much, but we've gotten a lot of these remakes again, and they started off strong, and some of them are still okay, like the reboot slash the soft reboot of Scream. At least the first one's decent. The first of the Gordon Green Halloween reboots is decent, but they go downhill really quickly. The and we're getting also crazy wacky horror again.
I love
Uh,
that.
My
Tucker
favorite,
and Dale.
Tucker and Dale, Barbarian, which is insane.
I haven't seen it, but everyone tells me it's great.
It's great because I think the guy who wrote it was just doing free association. Because it changes, it's all horror movies, but it changes the genre of horror movie like 3 times. Like, and it actually, we talk about say something about society. It does say stuff about society accidentally.
Mhm.
The ham-fisted ones like The Menu, don't really work. And I also think one of the interesting things is we talk about elevated horror saying something about society, but what does The Witch, The Lighthouse, or really even Hereditary actually say about society?
Look, I'm going to ask you. You're a smart man, and I respect your opinion. I am not that bright. I've tried to watch Vivitch 15 times. I fall asleep every time. Is it Ben says it's good? Dubin says it's good. Is it good? Am I just not that bright? I mean,
I think you are expecting a horror movie, and what you're getting is an art house movie that has a horrific ending.
And I have to wait for the ending.
Yep, and you got to get to the ending.
That's how Hereditary was. I tried to watch Hereditary, and I was like, I just don't care. I mean, the little girl gets hit. That thing, I was like, whoa. And then that kind of kept me watching it. But then I was like, I just don't care.
Hereditary is very similar, and in it, I mean, I think it's I would say it's definitely in tradition of The Exorcist, actually, and what it's doing. But I find Ari Aster films to be very start and stop. So you'll get one shocking thing, and then you get an hour of good cinematography and slow build, and you get another shocking thing. I like Ari Aster movies, but I really don't think they're for everyone. Whereas I have liked going back to well-made fun horror movies. And for what I said earlier, right now we're awash in shit streaming movies, but there's been a lot, more good horror movies in the last 4 or 5 years on streaming.
Have you watched the Pizzagate Massacre? Have you watched that?
No, I have not. See,
I had that director on this show. For you guys that don't know, the director of that movie came on here. When you talk about so many movies coming out, capitalist production, this is the downside to streaming and being able to have all these choices, in my opinion.
we don't know. There's so many that I can't keep up.
I can't. I can have the biggest list of stuff I want to see known to man, but those things fall off all the time now because of licensing rights. That's going crazy right now. B, there's just too much that I'll never know where it is. Like, I kind of miss the days of a curated experience. Come on, cable, tell me what I want to see. And the Pizzagate Massacre is one of those movies that you're talking about. It's fun. It's suspenseful. It's a low budget movie with people that you don't really know. A lot of these guys, this is their first big feature film. And the acting really was good. and it's got social commentary. It's got all the things that you want it to have, but every movie doesn't have to be the same thing. And I'm not going to say that this copycat generation is that much different than the copycats we saw in the 80s, but I feel like you got called out when you bit back then. This is just a bad version of blah blah blah. Musically too. Oh, why are you listening to that band or that group? They just sound like a bad version of blah blah blah. They're the poor man's version of blah blah blah. Now everybody is the poor man's version of blah blah blah. Everybody is just biting something that's popular. Jordan Peele makes Get Out, and every black filmmaker has to make Get Out. It's like, you don't have to do the exact same thing he did. Can we not take these people seriously unless they have social commentary? Can a female make a movie that doesn't have to be a feminist critique on blah, blah, blah?
Or about trauma?
Yeah. Like, to me, that's the racism. That's the sexism. That, like, no black person can make a movie that's just like an entertaining fucking film. It has to always be this over-the-top social commentary about race.
And everything that's made by a woman has to somehow go back to being some version of the Babadook. Like some big metaphor for trauma. Yeah.
I feel like maybe you just can't get your movie made unless you do that song and dance. So the same kind of way we talk about, the one thing that's winning in this world that we live in called the left, anti-racism, BLM, kneecapped it more than anything else. I think I said this last night on the show, and it has an effect in pop culture as well, where, can these people make movies? There's a young Latina filmmaker that made kind of a fun little movie called Bingo Night Hell or Bingo Hell. Mm-hmm. Have you seen that?
No.
It's like, it's fun. And it doesn't really hit you over the head with social commentary. And she just made one of the VHS movies, which are like found footage films.
Yeah.
She just made the new one, the VHS 1985. And I haven't checked that out. But, she does dig making fun films that don't have to hit you over the head with social commentary. And I feel like this genre used to have that to some extent. And there are some people that are making that. Again, Tucker and Dale is pretty fucking hilarious. Mm-hmm. But a lot of the A24 stuff, it's like, it feels like it has to be so important. Like, did you try to watch Lamb?
No, I did not. I mean, to be fair, when you keep on mentioning Tucker and Dale, but that movie's over 12 years old.
You know what? I'm over 12 years old, so go fuck yourself.
You just keep on mentioning it like in the same thing as movies from like 5 years ago. So I'm like, okay. But
I haven't seen too many funny ones like that. I've seen a lot of copycats of that.
I've seen some that have tried, but yeah, it's so overwhelming right now, the amount of stuff that's being made and being instantly forgotten. Like, what was that? Was it the Fear Factor movies or what's the, not Fear Factor, Fear Street movies?
I heard that was a really good series. Did you watch that? All those movies?
I watched the first one. It was good, but like, they're very much like, you want to talk about direct ripoffs. Like they're 80s books, but set in different decades, and they basically pastiche the decade that they're in. So it's interesting. I think that the genre that's probably irking me, and I don't know if Lamb is part of this, and I love this genre normally, but is like the folk horror like those have gotten so repetitive. And I love folk horror. I actually do. It's actually one of my favorite subgenres. Like one of my favorite movies. We mentioned so many, but one of my favorite movies is The Wicker Man, and And then I like the first Midsommar, which is a Swedish movie from the 90s.
Oh, that's a remake?
No, it's not a remake. Midsommar is, well,
It's just different.
Midsommar actually rips off directly and knowingly and calls attention to it, both the other Midsommar and The Wicker Man. Like,
I saw the Wicker Man remake or rip off bit of it.
yeah.
Yeah.
But so if you've seen those two movies, you actually, there's certain things you're like, oh, okay, that's part of what's going on there. But yeah, to me, like, that genre is kind of getting tired. The social commentary stuff, I liked the current sequel to Candyman, but it also felt a little ham-fisted.
I won't watch it.
And the God, the show that, like, everybody learned what Sundown Home was. Oh, Lovecraft Country, which was very much anti-racism as written by a white guy, as portrayed by a black female director for a white audience. And
Thanks, Ibrahim X. Kendi.
Yeah, that was and that show was frustrating because every now and again it would be good, and then it would, like, I'm not normally one to complain about woke being a problem in anything. That's not really my genre of criticism, but there were times where I'm like, oh my God, like, you were almost interesting, and then you had to do the exact thing that I thought you would do. And it almost felt like a satire, but it wasn't. And so, but I think that's going away too. I mean, like DEI and corporations, it seems to be going away. So it's yeah, I Lovecraft Country, there's 2 episodes that I think are great. That there is a episode set in Korea that I think is actually really good, but most of that show ends up being dog crap.
Someone's Sheriff Liberty says Lovecraft Country played a James Baldwin quote as a screen transition.
It did.
Oh my God. Are you serious?
Yeah, that show is just to remind you, now you did have a black female director.
Sounds
but
about
and it was funded by Jordan Peele, but produced. But its writer of its source material
is a white guy.
Is a white guy.
Yeah.
So and it very much sometimes feels like a black director taking a white guy's attempt at being anti-racist with Lovecraft and ham-fisting it into a show. And there was a lot of stuff right after The Reckoning that tried to do that, and very little of it worked. Jordan Peele's 3 movies, I believe, like Get Out, Us, and Nope. I think and Nope is the most interesting of those in my opinion.
Oh, really? I haven't seen Nope yet.
Yeah, Nope is crazy, and that's why it's interesting. That's another movie that's like 4 different. It's a sci-fi, western, satire, horror movie. So it's this is Jordan Peele definitely throwing spaghetti against the wall, but it's good. But those 3 movies kind of get it right together, but I feel like that's kind of been it. The rest seem to try too hard. And there's been, I think one of the scariest movies I've found in the last 10 years is not a horror movie, although it could easily be one. And I think it's even kind of shot like one. And that's Nightcrawler.
With Jake Gyllenhaal?
Yeah, the Gyllenhaal movie. About
that's a good
like
movie.
That movie is terrifying.
You know what it was supposed to be called? Coyote. because he acts like a coyote.
Right.
And I didn't peep that. And I watched it again after I read that. And I was like, ooh, he does. That movie is, I don't like to watch it by myself at night because it's very unsettling.
Yeah, it's up there with Possession and movies that really upset me.
Mhm.
Like,
Mhm.
um, uh, and yeah, someone's like, it's a modern day Taxi Driver, except it's kind of more disturbing than
It's
Taxi
way more
Driver.
disturbing. There's no redeemable qualities about that person because he's supposed to be a coyote. He's supposed to be like, I'm doing whatever I can do to survive.
I mean, it's yeah. Someone says it's a black comedy. It's a black comedy that's so black that it's almost not funny.
It's not. Where's the laughter?
Like it's like yeah, it's like it starts off. You can kind of feel like it's cringe comedy because all the other characters are also awful, but
Mhm.
they're so less awful compared to him. Um, but so
Someone asked
yeah,
what movie this is. It's called Nightcrawler.
Nightcrawlers from 2014, I believe.
That was a good
Um,
movie.
is No Country for Old Men a horror movie? No.
No, it's really
Uh,
long and didn't do anything for me.
I like No Country for Old Men, but no. Um, uh, I think No Country. Those Coen brothers versions of Cormac McCarthy novels are interesting in that they are affectless. So if you need affect, it's good. I would actually tell people to read the source material. I like those movies, but yeah. Um, so 07. Yeah, I mean
Shout out to
the,
Ken. Ken, thank you for the super chat. Yeah, 7 is what's in the box. That was almost a sound drop.
I mean there's a kind of like shocking neo noir from the mid 90s
Mhm.
that all of them skirt on horror movies, even when they're like sci-fi. Again, to bring it back to the title of the show, which we haven't
Mhm.
talked about, but like as 12 Monkeys a horror movie. Like I kind of do sincerely think 12 Monkeys. I watched first time I saw 12 Monkeys in 7. Um I was
You're probably in high
w-
school, huh?
I was and I was living at a friend's house
Okay.
cuz I was technically homeless. And we I saved up my loading dock money because that's what I did for a side gig. Well, a side gig because it was my only job. I just anyway, and I rented all the movies that had the most edgy uh posters at the movie rental place. So we got 7, 12 Monkeys, and The Exorcist 3. And
Mm.
um I s- and The Addiction. Uh, So we rented 4 movies. And The Addiction. I watched it with a friend I was living with. Um, yeah, I was in high school, but The Addiction is great. 7 is great. Um, uh,
Exorcist
and
3 is amazing.
Exorcist 3 is great. It's a very different movie than the other ones I'm mentioning.
Yes.
It actually feels like an older movie, but I saw it that time, so they all stuck in my head. I
Oof.
had like the and 12 Monkeys is great. So like I watched and we watched them in one weekend.
Mhm.
So yeah, um So yeah, 7 was terrifying the first time I saw it, people talking about it, and it's one of those where like you can kind of get into every character's head and be disturbed by it.
Mhm.
Um uh I think 12 Monkeys is interesting because it seems like a just, a dystopian uh sci-fi movie, and then the end is just gutting. Um and well, of course, Exorcist 3 arguably as good or better than The Exorcist. I go back and forth on that. And then what's the other one I mentioned that we watched? Oh, The Addiction. The Addiction is a terrifying. It would be labeled art house. I mean, elevated horror now, but it's a terrifying, like Christian allegory vampire movie.
Mm.
That if it was not in black and white would be unwatchably violent. So yeah, if you want, since we've like kind of indirectly given our recommendations for each decade, there you go. Those are my 90s ones. I think Exorcist 3 is the 90s. It's just the early 90s.
It's 90. It's 1990. And that's going to be the show for Saturday. Actually, Ben's going to come on and we're going to do kind of, what we wanted to do for the In Search of Darkness people. They're making their new In Search of Darkness 1990 to 1994. So Ben and I will be discussing. If you're free and would like to jump on, you're more than welcome. Horror 1990 to 1994. What happened in these years? Why did everything kind of change?
What's those years? So what movies come out in
People Under the
90s?
Stairs come out. You get the tail end of the trilogy guys. So you get a few of the Texas Chainsaws that don't do really well. You get the end of Freddy. You get the end of not the end, but kind of the real forgotten Jason movies.
The bad Jason
the
movies.
real bad Jason movies. But
like
you get things like Misery.
Jason X. Oh, Misery's
You
fucking
get Misery. 1990, 94. So you get Misery, Exorcist 3, like I said, People Under the Stairs. I'd have
Candyman,
to say Candyman. Ooh, the first Candyman. Nightmare. Wes Craven's A New Nightmare is 94, I believe, and that's a really good movie.
Yeah, agreed. You can kind of see where Craven's going though, because while like Scream is funny and nothing's funny about New Nightmare, the meta part of it is in both. Like the meta commentary part of it is definitely in both those movies. And
I think does Parents come out in 1990? Or is that 89?
I think it's 89.
Frankenhooker is 1990.
Oh, that's a great movie. I mean, it's not a good movie, but it's a great
movie. Yeah. Like there's movies in this time frame that I think a lot of people forgot are 90s movies. And I kind of want to look at this moment in horror because I do look at it. Someone said, is this the end of history horror? And yeah, I think things change when there's no monster for America. And that monster is the Soviet Union. And once it's gone, then what is terrifying us?
Wait, isn't the first of the
Tremors 1, I think, is in between 90 and 94.
What is it?
Dusk Till Dawn.
Demon Knight.
Demon Knight is 89. 88, I think. The first
88.
Demon Knight. There's a sequel.
Yeah, that's okay. I can't remember that movie. What's interesting is that movie feels more like an early 90s movie than it does a late 80s movie. But yeah,
someone said Twin Peaks. Twin Peaks definitely comes out in 90, 91. There's a Interview with the Vampire comes out in like 93, I think.
Yeah, I saw that movie like multiple times in the theater because my mom was a big old Anne Rice nerd.
In the Mouth of Madness, yeah. Phantasm 2, I believe, comes out in the 90s. So there's some movies in this time frame that I think are really interesting, and I know Ben hasn't seen them all. Maybe you've seen a few more.
I don't think I've seen everything that you have listed so far. I mean,
if you want to jump on with us, I would appreciate it and enjoy the fun talk because
yes.
I think what's funny about what we're talking about today, like, are these science fiction movies, and we only got to a little bit. I knew we were going to get derailed, but are these science fiction movies, horror movies? Again, my whole point is there's a lot of movies that have horrifying elements to them. And that's just what I look for. If a movie has horrifying elements to it, then to me, it's just a scary movie.
Oh, someone mentions okay, you guys have just gotten me really distracted. But I'm going to just suggest this as one of the last thoughts. Jason, have you seen all the Phantasm series?
Yep.
Those movies are fucking great. And they're nuts. The only thing that's more nuts is probably the Hellraiser movies, but the Hellraiser movies are bad after the first two. They just jump off of a cliff, like just jump. I mean, the third one's at least fun, but they just jump off a cliff. Whereas the Phantasm movies are, because they're made by the same people with some exceptions, close to the same cast over 30 years. They're remarkably consistently good.
We're trying to get Coscarelli on the show.
Oh,
I don't know. I think he made them all. Didn't he make them all?
Yeah, he made them all.
But you know who I'm talking to Sunday?
Who?
Brian Yuzna.
What?
Yeah. Society, Bride of Reanimator. Yep.
Oh, you told me that. Yes.
Special stream.
Man, Society is one of the most fucked up
my goodness. Hey, just so people know, we're having a champagne room tonight. I don't know, Barnes, you're not joining me for the champagne room. Are you going to bed?
I can do a little bit.
Because that's just where we can just be more free to say bad words.
Yeah, let's we haven't really been on point now, so we can probably jump over.
Okay. Do you want the link to send to your Varn?
Yeah, I'll take that. I'll send it to my
Okay,
buddy.
anyone listening right now on Varn's stream, Varn is gonna have a link for you guys so you can watch this as well. It's just gonna be us talking mad shit. Tucson will be with us. We'll be laughing at a few videos. We'll be making fun of people that we probably don't feel comfortable making fun of publicly. Matt Hendrickson says, I'm getting my girlfriend, who's a bigger horror fan than me, to watch Phantasm for the first time this weekend. Phantasm 1 is such an insane film.
God, I still have nightmares from the first time I fucking saw that movie.
You can't, again, though, there's movies that you can watch when you're going to sleep and you're like, whatever. Like, I can put on Tales from the Crypt.
Oh, yeah.
And be like, oh, I'm going to sleep. Like, and we have to do a whole episode on anthology horror. I love Creepshow. Again, 90s Tales from the Dark Side, which is supposed to be Creepshow 3. Creepshow 3 is the worst movie of all time. No one go watch Creepshow 3. It's so horrible. Don't
Creepshow 3 or Tales from the Dark Side?
I love Tales from the Dark Side.
Okay,
Creepshow 3 is Tales from the Dark Side was supposed to be Creepshow 3. Licensing issues, rights, all that stuff. A lot of the same people that were behind Creepshow did Tales from the Dark Side. It's Stephen King stories in it. It's good. You watch Creepshow 3, they somehow convinced Romero to sell him the rights to the name. There's no Stephen King stories in it. It's just stupid. Bad special effects, a silly story that's all connected. Sometimes that shit works well. It didn't work well in Creepshow 3. It really sullied the name. Creepshow 2 is not that great, but man, is Creepshow 3 really, really bad. But there's a lot of 90s underwater horror that's based off Alien that I love.
Like
Star Sticks.
Oh, you don't mean Cocoon
movies.
Oh yeah, The Abyss, yes.
Yeah, all the Abyss wannabe movies. Someone says Videodrome. Yeah, that's a fucking great film. They made a Creepshow TV series I've seen a little bit of it. It's pretty good. Again, I love anthology stuff. I
think there's a Tales from the Dark Side
show
yes. Too. Yeah.
All those things that came on regular TV late at night. Tales from the Dark Side when they redid it in the 90s. Monsters. Do you remember Monsters that used to come on TV late at night?
Yeah. You used to watch that and Outer Limits roughly at the
Outer Limits remake. I watched Amazing Stories. Anything that's anthology, I'm all about it. Leviathan, I thought was rather entertaining.
People are gonna start throwing out random movies now.
I can see people talk about stuff, but and those movies, I felt like the underwater movies definitely are the same thing about that whole science fiction horror. What is it? And they just made horror movies in an outer space underwater. I think that's all that stuff was. How do we capitalize on this underwater thing?
Yeah.
So I'm going to send you the link. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with Derick and I. Thank you guys so much for your commentary. If you want to join us in the champagne room, we might talk a little more shit as usual. We're definitely going to get a little looser. Derick's got a whole Coke Zero in him now.
I gotta fill up some more tea, actually. But yeah.
Tucson is going to join us, and we're going to have a good old time. So thank you guys so much for hanging out, and we are
Got it.
Back when Russia was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and they'd say, "Oh, but aren't you so glad that you're in America?" I said, "Well, I know a lot of Russian filmmakers. They have a lot more freedom than I have. All they have to do is be careful about criticizing the government."